we're going to talk about how do we actually apply storytelling. So there'll be lots of demos and some good conceptual conversation, but first I'll tell you a little bit about me. I live in Denver. I'm a consultant with Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. I'm on Twitter. Feel free to tweet questions at me afterwards. My Twitter feed is like half data, half dogs and Colorado landscapes. And I blog at datasavvy.me. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. I'm also one of the organizers of Workout Wednesday, and I asked permission to tell you a little bit about Workout Wednesdays real quick before I jump into the rest of the presentation. It is a weekly challenge done in Power BI where we pick a topic and just kind of help you explore it. So we started this at the beginning of 2021. There's 4 of us that are organizers and we rotate. Each one of us contributes every 4 weeks essentially. This week is about the new Charticulator visual. So we've done lots of different topics, starting from very, very basic, connect to some data, create a really simple model, to drill down to dealing with formatting and long labels and conditional formatting and doing a little bit of DAX to help you switch measures. You can see forecasting and custom visuals. So the way this works is we have a page for each week. So this is this week's that went out yesterday. And we'll give you a little bit of information about what it is we're, there we go, what it is we're doing. So we give you the finished product that you're trying to make, and then we give you the requirements and tell you how to either get the data or get the PBIX file we are supplying. And then we have a solution video at the bottom to help you if you get stuck. And then you can share it on LinkedIn or Twitter, and you just tag us and use these hashtags. And so we can talk about it. Sometimes we find interesting enhancements we want to request, or somebody has a better way to do things. It's been a lot of fun so far this year. So if you haven't had a chance to try it out, please do check out the challenges. There's no time limit. So if you want to go back and do week 1 this week, you are more than welcome. If you do participate and you like getting internet points, there is a submission tracker on the site. So you can actually fill it in and let us know that you are participating. And then you get to see yourself in this lovely Tableau report, because Workout Wednesday started with Tableau. But you can get credit for both. If you're a Tableau person, please also do the Tableau exercises. But we can see we have way more traffic than the Tableau people right now, so help us keep it up. As we get to the later weeks, it slows down a little bit, so we're trying to keep ahead there. So that is Workout Wednesday, and feel free to message me on Twitter or tweet at me if you're interested and need help finding anything. It's just workout-wednesday.com. Thank you guys for letting me promote that real quick. I think it's important because it's part of the Power BI data visualization community, which is what I'm talking about today. So let us switch gears and let's talk about stories. Think about, what are the elements of a story? Of any story, not data specific, just stories. In general, there seem to be about 5 important elements. And first we have context or setting. We need to set the stage and explain the environment, surroundings, any backstory that's important. And then we have characters. And those are the individuals who our story is about. And there's usually a main character who determines how the plot will develop. And of course, part of the plot is conflict or problems. The plot of the story is centered on this conflict. and how the characters resolve or attempt to resolve the problem. People love a good conflict. That's why we watch soap operas, read books. And of course, if we have a problem, we need a resolution. So we get invested and then need to know how everything works out for the characters. And our last element is emotions. Will Storer said, a story is a description of something happening that contains some form of sensation or drama that is soaked in emotion. It's this emotion that is crucial to the story, and it makes you feel. And that feeling is what causes you to remember the story and potentially act on its lessons. So in addition to those elements, stories have a pretty recognizable structure, and it often takes the form we see here with a recognizable beginning, middle, and end. You might also recognize this as situation, conflict, and then resolution. In the beginning, we introduce our context, our setting, and our characters. Then we introduce the conflict and build it up to a climax before we come to the resolution where the conflict is solved and we all live happily ever after, at least in some stories. But another common structure for a story, especially in data storytelling and persuasive narratives, is this using the middle of the story to explain what could be and contrasting that with how things currently are. For example, when I was in college, I studied international business with minors in computer science and Spanish and Latin American studies. I did my study abroad in Chile, and I always kind of wanted to live in Central or South America for a while. But life took other interesting turns and twists, and I currently live in Denver. But sometimes I think about what could be. And one of my favorite animals is the capybara. Not sure if you're familiar with those. They are large rodents related to guinea pigs and chinchillas, but they can be up to 4 feet long and 2 feet tall. And they are very social. And there's a whole subreddit called Critters on Capybaras, where you can see all kinds of other animals just hanging out with capybaras. They're just very chill. I dream of a farm in South America where I raise capybaras. But right now, I live in Denver and raise a cranky bulldog. I would live in a hut and enjoy being close to nature. But right now, I own a townhome in Denver that requires cleaning and maintenance and a nice big mortgage payment. Capybaras are so chill and social, but life in Denver is full of stress and I barely know my neighbors. So as soon as we get through this pandemic, I should sell my house, move to South America, and start a capybara farm. Then I could live a life free of super expensive housing, spend more time outdoors, and be less stressed. And of course, just be friends with a capybara. So that's how that structure works. Why do we talk about this in DataViz? Why did I start out with a whole thing about storytelling and not talk about data at all? Well, it's because stories are a great way to communicate and keep what you've communicated memorable for our end consumers. And part of that is just the very logical structure. We present background, characters, conflict, and then resolution. You get the information you need, and then you move to the next step in the story. It's easy to follow. Every culture has stories. We're familiar with how they go. Young children can make up stories. Stories are also just engaging. We get wrapped up in the story because we love a good conflict and it's satisfying to see the resolution. That emotion that I mentioned earlier gets us caught up in the story and it makes it memorable. There are probably some stories you remember from your childhood. I could tell you the story of the 3 Little Pigs today, and I haven't told it or read it in well over a decade. That's why we like stories. But in the data viz community in general, not just specific to Power BI, but across tools, we maybe misuse the word story. So some smart people that I look up to and take inspiration from in the data viz community have written about this. John Schwabish runs PolicyViz, and he had a whole series of like 5 blog posts about what is story. And he says that many of us use that word story over and over again as we make our graphs and visualizations, and we need to be more careful with that word and use it only when appropriate. We're getting people to feel deeply when we're leading them to a meaningful climax. That's really story, not just any data viz we put on a page. There is a data visualization society that runs a Nightingale is kind of their blog. And Joshua Smith won, I forget which Tableau contest now, but he won one of those Tableau contests, and he got rated really highly on story. And he found that pretty interesting, and he wrote about it after the fact. And what he wanted people to know, and I love this statement, is it's important to highlight that a visualization is not more or less powerful, beautiful, or important because it does or doesn't tell a story. Oh, it was Iron Viz. He won Iron Viz in 2019. So he is a well-respected data visualization professional who got highly rated on story and came back and said that wasn't really story. And here's why. So if you have a chance to read Is Your Data Actually a Story, I encourage it. And this idea is from John Schwabish as well, but I think it's really important to understand. Not all data visualization is a story. Some things are simply annotation. Annotations are well organized and they have a logical order. They're useful. But a story has a plot with a climax and emotional engagement, the conflict and the characters for people to get attached to. But in between annotation and story is narration. And this is where we describe what's going on and we frame our reader's journey. But maybe there isn't a true conflict with emotions. If you can get your Power BI report all the way to story, that's great. But sometimes it's just not. But we have the tendency to do this very dry, sparse reporting that's barely an annotation. And moving your report further to the right on this spectrum humanizes your topic, and it makes it more relatable and memorable. So a lot of the time, what we're really aiming for is a happy medium where we're providing narration rather than story. So if you see people raving about storytelling and then you look at your reports and you feel a bit puzzled, you can kind of let yourself off the hook because not everything is a true story, and that's okay. But just because we don't necessarily have a story doesn't mean we get to just throw stuff on the page and call it good. We still need things to be organized in a purposeful way. So there was this Twitter hashtag a while back now, maybe like a year, where it was like describe a movie in 9 words or something, or tell a story badly is essentially what it was. And somebody tweeted about Lord of the Rings and they said, group spends 9 hours returning jewelry. It's accurate, but those of you who have seen Lord of the Rings or read the books know that that leaves out so much, and none of that makes it memorable by just saying that. That's kind of what we're doing with storytelling in data visualization. Yeah, sales are up, but could we humanize that more and provide more context and make it memorable so that people who can affect it know why sales are up, or whatever your purpose of your visualization is. Oh, it skipped one. So first, I want to address the question I hear a lot. Okay, what do I do if I don't have a story? I just have a report with some annotation or narration. My response to that is no matter the amount of story you have, you always have a message. So your message is your key takeaway. The answer to the question, so what? And when you're designing, you need to define your message first for the entire report. You need to be able to tell me in 1 to 2 sentences why this report exists and what I should get out of it. Then I add visuals. And I need to be able to explain for every single visual how it relates to my overall report message. And if I can't explain how that visual relates to my report message, maybe that visual doesn't belong on my report. And at this level, this is kind of a whiteboarding exercise. I actually did this in a pre-con that I taught last year, and we passed out sticky notes. And I just had people write the message of their overall report and then use the sticky notes to write the message of each chart within their report and to arrange it in a really logical order. So at this point, you don't even choose a chart type. You don't have to decide if it's a line chart, bar chart, whatever. You just have to be able to articulate who your intended audience is and what idea you want to convey to them or your report message, and then the questions you want to answer with the visuals around that message. So let's take a look at a visualization that I think does a good job of defining a message and purposefully designing to support that message. I asked the author if I could use this because I think it does a good job clearly articulating a message. I actually found this in the Data Visualization Society Slack. So if you are interested, you should definitely join. There's good conversation in there. And so her message is that she wanted to know, and I'm going to zoom in a little here. She wanted to know if a larger production budget made a movie more likely to get an Oscar nomination, and the answer was no. So first she has this very clear descriptive title in which she actually states the conclusion she's drawn after analyzing the data. And then she has nice explanatory text that provides supplementary information in support of answering this question. And then she has charts that clearly support the message. So on the left, we have the number of Oscar nominations for the movies listed in the center. And then on the right, we have the production budget related to those movies. So everything on this page can be easily justified as supporting her message. And that visualization was very easy because the author was working with static data. But a lot of the Power BI reports in our organization are dynamic. And by that, I mean the data is set to refresh on a schedule. So we can't know that sales are up this quarter. We know the numbers will change. So sales might be up right now, and 2 months from now, they'll be down. So what happens when we want to change our approach to accommodate dynamic data? So where we may have inexplanatory data visualization, the report creator takes on most of the responsibility for telling that story, conveying that message. When we go to more exploratory, because we have dynamic data that's changing and different audience members that care about different things, that shifts some of that responsibility back to the report consumer. So we have sort of a vague plot without details of specific numbers, and we provide interactive controls to let the user focus on the slice that's most important to them. We provide signals, things like KPIs, gauges, to tell the consumer how things are going, and then we provide context. This is our background information, things the report consumer needs to create their own conclusions and build their own story. So this is more your typical corporate Power BI report. And Andy Kirk, who's another good data visualization person to follow, he is Visualizing Data on Twitter, and that's also his website. He calls this story forming. I actually had a quick email exchange with him a while back and got to blog about it because I needed a name for this. And he was like, oh, that's story forming. So basically the change is in how you think about it. You don't know the answer to your question, but you do know the question that you want to answer. So instead of saying bicycle sales are up year over year. We might just know that we want to show year over year sales by product category. Even with dynamic data, we can still go for a bit of story. In Power BI, this might mean using DAX formulas to populate titles and text explanations using conditional formatting. This is where that new smart visual or smart narrative visual might come in handy. Or sometimes I use the enlightened data story custom visual. So it's as if we're telling the story, but the actual plot details are data-driven. And we could also add a bit of machine learning to help pick out important data points and trends. So we're going to look at this example of story forming. And it's a report that I made a couple years ago about the questions that people ask about Power BI on Stack Overflow. So we can see I have my interactive controls. Maybe I'm looking at a specific year, just a slicer. I have the cards and the waffle charts and my table that's formatted as a sort of heat map. And those are my signals to tell you how things are going, what's going on. And then we have some line charts to provide additional information to understand more context. So if this data refreshes, we could add 2020 and 2021, and everything else about this would be okay because we're story forming. So the report recognizes a logical order. First, I tell you that we're looking at Power BI questions on Stack Overflow, and that there are 4,361 questions asked. Then there's 2,800 different users asking those questions, and people are getting about 4,300 answers total. So that's about one answer per question. And then I tell you the median life in days, which is how long is a question alive from the point of when it was asked to the last comment or answer on there. So they're pretty short-lived, but there's lots of comments. People are asking clarifying questions or commenting maybe alternative things to consider. And then on Stack Overflow, you can vote things up or down, and so that's the question score. But when we look at these waffle charts, we'll see 77% of questions get answered. That's pretty good. That rate is not as good on some other forums. People, if you like your internet points and you're thinking, oh, maybe I want to help answer questions on Stack Overflow, especially in the Power BI tag, people are not very good about marking the answers as accepted. Very few questions get closed, meaning someone asked a poor question, they didn't provide enough information, or it was really off topic. So that's also another good indicator. So I deliberately set some context with some summary stats to help you know whether you might want to use Stack Overflow, either to learn about Power BI or ask questions when you're stuck. And once we got through those summary stats, I provided a bit more context. That's these line charts. So I'm looking at questions asked over time, and then views of questions by creation date, meaning there's some questions from years ago that are still getting a lot of views. They're still way up there. So you can see what topics in this last matrix have good participation. Right now it's DAX, and that could change over time, but Stack Overflow is initially a developer board, so that kind of makes sense. So if I'm needing help with DAX or want to help other people with DAX, maybe I do go hang out on the Stack Overflow Power BI category. If it's about visualizations or Python reporting services, maybe not so much. So that's what we can do even on a one-page report, just putting things in the order in which it makes sense to set our stage, provide the information, and provide ways to either filter or drill down to what our users think is important. And one thing that came out last year was this smart narrative visual. I believe it's still in preview. And let me close some things up here. This report came from the Power BI team from their September blog last year, so you can go and find this and download it as well. This product summary is the smart narrative visual. So we talked about narrative, describing what's going on. If we didn't have this, we could look at our visuals and, we could see visits versus revenue and how revenue started going up and visits started going down in January, or in 2020 rather. And that by far outdoor products are the largest portion of sales. But this thing is actually reading our data to pick out important trends to communicate. So it's looking at all the data points on the page and it's letting us know, hey, revenue and visits both trended up between March 2018 and April 2020. The average of visits was higher than revenue. And then it's going to look at between January 2018 and April 2020, outdoor had the largest increase in sales. So that's this first chart. And electronics had the largest decrease. Outdoor accounted for 54.67% of sales. We could see that here, but just having the text there to provide this to tell people, hey, here's some interesting things you probably want to be aware of in this data, instead of making them go through the effort to identify this themselves, can be really useful. There's still more being conveyed in the chart, but hey, maybe we need to know that outdoor is over half of sales. So that's the smart narrative, and you just add it to your page, and you can actually customize it and choose a little bit, some of the values, and you could do it off an individual visual or the entire page. So keep that in mind as one way to help tell your narrative. It's definitely not a story in as far as our definition we've just discussed. But it does tell a good narrative. And then let's look quickly at a Power BI report that I'm going to show you how I use conditional formatting to help tell a narrative in the context of story forming. So this is just the HR sample report. The data came from the samples in Power BI, and I did a webinar last year with Rob Farley where we talked about, how do we take what was originally kind of messy. This is a super old sample, so we're not bagging on anyone. Power BI didn't do that much back when it was originally created. And then I turned it into something more like this. And one thing I did to help tell the story is that my titles changed based upon the data. So as I filter stuff, you'll see the little spinning wheels kind of at the top of the visuals. It's actually not only recalculating the data to display, but calculating what the title should be. So I'm doing this with conditional formatting. I'm trying to see if I can get one to flip there. There we go. Has decreased over time. And now it's increased. And all that is a DAX calculation that I made beforehand. So I just organize them and call it titles. So here's my active employee count over time. And I just did a switch statement. So I looked at the beginning, what my data points were, and then what my data points were at the end, and just did essentially subtraction and looked at the sign to see if it's positive or negative. So what's the change? Same thing. Let's do This one, all I did was I already had a measure that was the change, meaning new hires plus separations. So what's the difference over time? And I just spell it out. If if that change is positive, then new hires have exceeded separations over time. So all of these for me kind of worked like this, but you could have written any DAX formula you wanted. It didn't have to be take the beginning and the end. It could be anything you want so that your titles can be more helpful. So in static data viz, especially if you read storytelling with data, we'll hear things like, oh, you need to, if you can, state a conclusion for your titles so that people know what they're getting when they go to read the chart. So that's what we're doing here. And all I did was do the conditional formatting for the title text, and you choose, there's only one option, by field value, and then you go choose the DAX calculation that you wrote beforehand. So when there is no title, you just click the little FX button. I have a measures table where I put all that, and then actives over time, and it'll add it right in there. So that's one way to help tell a narrative, is go ahead and state your conclusions even though your report changes, but use DAX to change the conclusions. All right, let's check in and see if there are any questions or comments.
Nothing right now.
Okay, we'll keep going. So that report I just showed you had a sense of narrative, the HR report, but it wasn't quite a story. Regardless of if it's a full story, what do we actually do with our visuals and our pages to tell a narrative or a story in our reports? There is a lovely publication put out by Microsoft, and it was published in 2016, but I still think it's incredibly relevant today. It was a Microsoft research paper called Emerging and Recurring Data-Driven Storytelling Techniques. It's an analysis of a curated collection of recent stories. So what they did was they looked at a sample of techniques used by data viz practitioners to tell a data-driven story, regardless of visualization tool used. So it's not Power BI specific at all. And in fact, it's actually mostly looking at web-based kind of news magazine article type visualizations. But I really like this paper because it's very practical and applied without getting into deep technology. So I'm going to talk you through these 4 broad categories and show you examples of what they examined in the paper, and then an example I made in Power BI. And so you'll notice that some of my reports use multiple techniques while others just use one. So I'm going to show you this paper real quick, and I'll actually in there. It's a pretty short paper to read, but what I really like about it is they identified 4 broad categories, and I'm going to zoom in a bit. And then the tactics underneath those categories of how they tell a story. So these on the right, this list is all the vizzes that they looked at. And so you can see some of them use all 4 categories, some of them use 3, a couple use 2. There might be one that only uses 1 in there. But it's really helpful to understand the technique without thinking only in Power BI terms, but we'll definitely apply it to Power BI. And then at the very end of this, there is, if you scroll to the bottom, the references still have all the links. And so even though this is from 2016, most of this data viz is still available. So you can grab the URLs and go look at these yourself to see, oh, now that I've seen the chart or the ones they talk about here in the actual paper, you can go and see it and interact with it yourself. So that's what we're going to do, is look at a small sample of these. So as I said, this paper describes 4 techniques, and we're going to walk through each of those 4 techniques. And the first one is just communicating narrative and explaining data. All it is interspersing your visualizations with text or video or audio. So this is a whole lot of what news and magazine articles do. And we're going to look at this Southwest article, which is this one. So this is from 538, and it's an article about avoiding the worst airports and finding the best flights. So we can see article with information and then a chart, and then more article with information and then another chart. Same thing as we scroll down, another one. So that's what we mean by interspersing your visualization with text or video or audio. My version of this is about my dog, Izzy. She is apparently asleep, otherwise she normally makes an appearance. But I adopted Izzy. She's a pandemic rescue. I got her last year from an animal shelter in Golden, here in Colorado. And they said she was a bulldog mix. I had an English bulldog before this, and he passed away, and I was ready to get another dog. So when I noticed Izzy was available, and I was the very first person to meet her, and I brought her home with me on April 28th, almost a year ago. And I knew she was part bulldog because her face is definitely kind of a bulldog face, but I didn't know what she was exactly because she has longer legs. She's not like a stubby English bulldog like what I had before. So I thought, oh, maybe she's a bulldog boxer mix. And you can see boxer and bulldog, that's pretty typical what they look like. I sent Izzy's DNA into one of those services that checks her DNA, and her results came back 100% Old English Bulldog, which was not what I was anticipating. So then I looked into Old English Bulldogs, and they are half English, and then the other half is part American Bulldog, part American Pit Bull Terrier, and part Bull Mastiff. And so Old English Bulldogs, they're actually developed in the 70s. So they're not an officially recognized breed in a lot of like the dog shows and all that, which I don't particularly care about. But the reason they were developed is that we've bred English Bulldogs to have a lot of health problems. And so they were breeding a Bulldog back to kind of what it looked like back in the 18th century, where it still has the friendly temperament of today, but maybe fewer health issues. So that's Izzy. But what I did, and in this case, I have one regular chart, and then some of my images are data viz because I want you to be able to see what Izzy looks like. That's part of the data that I'm telling the story with. So here's some text. Here's some images that support the text. Here's some text, more images, text, image, chart, and more text. That's all this is. You can do this all day long. Multiple pages or single page, it works just fine. That is our first technique. The second is linking separated story elements. So you can link through color, through interactivity, through animation, and this in Power BI is pretty easy to do with report themes to help set your colors and formatting, and then actions and buttons or shapes. So we're going to look at, this is an article from The Guardian, and it was last updated in 2015. So since then, gay marriage in the US is legal, but I like this as an example for how they link separated elements. So what they do is this circle, each color in the circle is about a specific topic. So I'm in Colorado. I'll hover over that and we can see red is marriage, yellow is hospital visitation, blue is adoption, green is employment, pink is housing, and so on. So we've seen these colors, they've defined them, and then they used kind of shades of the color how light or dark it is to indicate whether people have maximum rights and or more limited, and then of course gray as if it's prohibited, or the gray stripe, I should say. Otherwise, it's just unclear. Those same colors come down here. So if we look at hospital visitation, we can then see, again, by state, what's allowed. So we're still talking visitation rights with the yellow, and adoption is blue, just like it was up above, all the way down. So they just linked with color, and that was all they had to do. So I'm going to show you a report I made about my company a couple years ago. I'm actually working on updating it now. And I did something kind of similar, but I used two techniques, interactivity and color. So I work for Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. We're headquartered in Oceanside, California, because that's where Denny lives. And most of us have, I joined last, I'm the 0.08 in this graph. Several people have been there for quite a while. We have a lot of awards, and that includes MVP awards and vExpert for VMware. And we've worked with SQL Server for a really long time, where most of us stay pretty involved in the community, and then we decided it would be fun to just share some personal stuff about ourselves. So when I click on the bottom there, and actually I'm going to go back because that's not an ideal one. Here we go. It takes me to a page with more information about experience in education. So you can see how long people were working with SQL Server and Azure and Power BI, and how many of us have a higher education degree. So like I'm one of the two. I have an MBA as well as my undergrad. And then I can click and go back. And let's look at some fun facts. You can see number of children and pets. We asked, who's a morning person, who's a night owl? I like sleep. I don't like morning or late nights. What kind of phone OS? This is literally the cups of coffee each of us drink a day. I'm the 1 cup. And we find out, we used to like to travel pre-pandemic, and lots of us like cycling. Most of us like dogs. Denny has bunnies. And then we click back. So I used color because when I click through, that same purple color is what my detail, my drill through is. And then I used interactivity from the clicking to go into the specific category. All right, technique number 3. It's just enhanced structure and navigation. Use buttons. Let people actually click things to navigate. So in data viz in general, this could be scrolly telling, where we keep scrolling and the images change. This could be breadcrumbs. It could be menus. Just when we say, if you ever hear, this is in a lot of marketing, an app-like experience in Power BI, this is what we mean. We're saying we're using this technique. And so I'll show you this scrolly telling example from Bloomberg. And it's about how Americans are addicted to trucks. And all I'm doing is scrolling my mouse wheel down, and the text changes, and then the visualization changes, how it's grouped. And so we can keep going, and as we learn more about the topic from the text, we get the change in the visualization. So scrolly telling is kind of hard to do well in Power BI, and I don't advise it because the only thing you can do is make a really long page. But the more stuff you put on the page, the longer it can take to load. There is one out there that I've seen in the data stories gallery that did pretty okay. It didn't take very long. It was a sports related thing, soccer, football. But in general, sometimes if you try to do this and you don't have a lot of stuff hidden, where people have to click stuff to reveal it, it can be kind of difficult. So what I did was I decided to do enhanced navigation with buttons. I'm not originally from Denver. I moved here 5 years ago. And People in Denver cannot drive to save their lives. I don't know why they're so bad. They just are. And so I pulled the traffic data for Denver, and I wanted to analyze it across a few different facets. And so you'd think, oh, well, it's snowy in Denver, and we have lots of big, we're in the foothills by the mountains. So it must be because we're having accidents in the snow on big hills. And it turns out, no. Traffic accidents mostly occur on dry roads in daylight, in the afternoons on busy streets. We just tailgate a lot. We're reckless drivers. So I give you kind of an explanation on my analysis of time. Is it something particular to the day or the hour or the month? Well, Fridays have the most accidents. So do 8 o'clock in the morning, kind of your typical rush hour hours. So it's not at night when it's dark. It's not necessarily in the winter. We can look at location, and what we'll find is places near the major highways have a lot of accidents. We have 2 highways that intersect right next to downtown, so it's typically in those areas. This is the neighborhood right before I-70 and 25 meet. There's a lot of traffic right there. So that's not surprising. And then I looked at road conditions. So most accidents, they happen on just straight level roads in daylight when it's dry. It's not because of our weather at all. It's not because of the hills. It happens because people were driving carelessly and following too closely. I know because someone rear-ended me last August and I got the back end of my car replaced. So this is a really simple version of the enhanced navigation. I used buttons and I organized these buttons in the order in which I wanted you to analyze this. So we started with time, and then we moved to location, and then we moved to driving conditions. And all it is a button with a page navigation. You could do, next buttons or anything like that, and that falls into this category. So our last technique is called controlled exploration. This is where we allow users to make some selections. It's not a free-for-all where they can do anything, but it's a constrained exploratory activity. So we're going to look at this Oscars 2015 piece from The Guardian, and it's looking at whether winning Best Director kills your career. So it looks at Wes Anderson, Richard Linklater, and so it has this whole data viz and then a little bit of text. So that's kind of like our first technique. But then when we go to the bottom, there's this explore the data thing. So I can look up a director here. Let's go for Scorsese. Did I spell that right? Yes. So I can make it filter. I can choose whether I want to show the IMDb rating. I can hover to get the exact year, how old the director was, and which title their movie came from. And then the golden ones are when they won an Oscar. And so that's the little bit of exploration that we can do. We also saw exploration in this piece on trucks at the very end, and I kind of glossed over it so I could talk about it now, is that now at the bottom, I can choose how I want things to be grouped. So whether I want to do it by where the car is made, what brand the car is. So I drive a Mazda CX-5, and I can search for my Mazda, and that's over there. And then keep it highlighted as I change how I'm looking at this viz. So that's our controlled exploration. Oh, let's see. Finish. There we go. So I made this as a demo for a customer who has a lot of databases that are the same. And what I did was get some data. Their databases are Azure SQL databases, and we have log analytics turned on. So we're capturing lots of diagnostics information. And then I have a database metrics. So I had my more scripted summary and what all people can drill into. And then I had scripted metrics here. So they can actually choose what metric and which server they want and whether they want to see the min, max, or count. So right now I'm looking at CPU %. I could switch and do CPU used. I could do storage % and see how much storage. And right now I'm showing min and max, and I could change that and just do max. So this is my version of, you know, I put some stuff that was very formatted that here's what I wanted to tell you. And now you can go and within these parameters, so you only get to choose metric name, server name, aggregation. But within these parameters, here's what you can see, and it'll change this line chart. So we're wrapping up here. If you take nothing else away from this, remember that stories are engaging and they're memorable, and that's why we use them for data viz. But not everything is a story, and that's okay. So if you were sitting here going, there is no protagonist in my sales report, or these widgets that I'm getting IoT devices have no emotion, well, yes, and that's fine. Think of it as a narrative. You still want to convey the information in a way that's relatable to your audience. And that's why we want to push the dial a little bit towards story and make it a narrative more than an annotation as much as possible. We're humanizing this information so that people understand it and remember it and can engage with it. So regardless of if you have a true story, you can use those storytelling techniques explained in that Microsoft research paper. So the first was communicating narrative and explaining data. That's where we interspersed our data visualization with text. That was my Izzy report. The next was linking separate story elements, either through color or interactivity or some other property. And that was my report about my company, where I color-coded the categories and then let you click in on a button to go to a drill-through page that also shared that same color. And then we had enhancing structure and navigation. And that was my Denver traffic accident report, where I made buttons and actually had navigation across pages to help tell the story in meaningful chunks. And the last was providing controlled exploration. That's where we might have slicers or some kind of filter and other interactive objects in our report to let a user go in and explore for themselves. And that was my database management report, where I let people change the metric and choose the server. So hopefully seeing the technique applied in Power BI helps you create better data narratives. That is pretty much all I have. Feel free to reach out to me on social media or blog, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Great, thanks, Meagan. That was fantastic. So there's no questions, right? Well, the only question was somebody did ask if the slides were available. Generally, we don't distribute slides, but we do have the video. But I don't know if you'd be, maybe it's on your blog or something.
Yeah, they actually are. I'm going to grab the link real quick. If you go to datasavvy.me and you go to presentations, and I'll throw this in as an announcement. There's a PDF version of what I just showed you, so you're welcome to grab those.
Awesome, that's great. All right. Yeah, speaking for myself, I know it's building the data seems to be okay. It's how do you effectively communicate a story. I've recently started doing the controlled exploration, but yeah, that's about the limit of my visualization skills right now. So it definitely, no, it's nice seeing those other approaches. How do you build more interactive reports? I think I'm going to give that. It was the first one, the narrative, the dynamic DAX. I actually quite enjoyed that. That actually looks like an interesting approach to introducing those topics. I've just got 2 comments here quickly. Let's see if. Okay, so here's one question: is Power BI a web-based tool or an application to install on your computer? So that's very generic. I don't know if you want to. Yep.
Sure, it's actually kind of both. When you build, you're in a Windows desktop application. So what I have open for this human resources report is Power BI desktop, but you can't share very well just with these desktop files. So the service, which is where I opened up most of my reports from, this is powerbi.com. And so when most people consume a report, they'll consume it from here or from the mobile app. And so that part of it is very much web-based. The reports end up getting rendered as HTML5, I think. So it's both.
Awesome, thanks a lot. So if there's not any more questions, then well, thank you for your time, and thank you so much for your sort of fantastic presentation.